This is the story of a global economy that ships 80% of everything it produces through a handful of narrow waterways, and what happens when those waterways close. Right now, in March 2026, the Strait of Hormuz is effectively shut down. Brent crude has blown past $126 a barrel, and gas prices across the United States have jumped roughly $1 a gallon in just 3 weeks. 400 vessels sit idle in the Gulf of Oman, lined up for a passage that is not coming. And that is just one choke point. The Red Sea has been partially closed for over 2 years because of Houthi attacks, while China rehearses blockade operations around Taiwan, the island responsible for more than 90% of the world's most advanced computer chips. A naval blockade does not just stop warships, it stops everything. And to understand why, you need to understand the geography of global trade. 80% of global trade by volume travels by sea. In 2024, that came to 12.7 billion tons of cargo, squeezed through fewer than a dozen straits and canals. Think of them as the arteries of the world economy, because like arteries, pinching one shut sends shockwaves through every organ. The busiest of these passages is the Strait of Malacca, running between Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. At its thinnest point, it narrows to just 2.8 kilometers, less than 2 miles, and yet 23.2 million barrels of oil flow through it every single day. 29% of all maritime oil on Earth passes through that gap. 94,000 vessels transited Malacca in 2024, carrying more than $2.8 trillion worth of goods annually, which means roughly 80% of China's imported crude oil depends on this single passage. Japan gets about 80% of its oil through Malacca, and South Korea sends roughly 70% the same way. Then you come to the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide between Iran and Oman, split into 2 shipping lanes of 2 miles each. Before the current crisis, 20.9 million barrels of oil per day moved through it, around 20% of all the petroleum the world consumes. Layered on top of that, over 20% of global LNG trade flows out the same bottleneck, mostly from Qatar. Crude oil alone accounts for $1.4 billion in daily energy value transiting Hormuz. Beyond those two, the Suez Canal normally handles 12 to 15% of global seaborne trade. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which guards the entrance to the Red Sea, carries above $2 trillion in annual commerce. 46% of container movements between the US and Northeast Asia rely on the Panama Canal, and the Turkish Straits see over 45,000 vessels a year. Every one of these passages can be choked, and none of them has a real substitute. Of everything funneled through these choke points, energy triggers the fastest crisis when supply cuts off. Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote in 1890 that the power to secure sea communications, or interrupt them, affects the very root of a nation's vigor. That observation only grew more accurate with time. Look at what happened when Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, following United States and Israeli strikes in late February 2026. Commercial traffic collapsed to near zero by March 14th. Brent crude, which had been sitting around $69 a barrel, rocketed past $126 a barrel, an increase of roughly 83%. American gas prices climbed about $1 per gallon within 3 weeks. The International Monetary Fund's general estimate is that a sustained 10% oil price increase pushes global inflation up by about 0.4 percentage points, while cutting growth by 0.1 to 0.2%. What the world experienced at Hormuz dwarfed a 10% move. And here is the thing about alternatives. There barely are any. Combined bypass capacity from the Saudi East-West pipeline and the United Arab Emirates AD-COP pipeline maxes out at 4 to 7 million barrels a day against the roughly 20 million barrels a day that normally transit the Strait of Hormuz. That covers about 13% of normal flow. For liquefied natural gas, the picture is even worse. Energy analyst Robin Mills put it bluntly in March 2026. For gas, there is no alternative route available now at all. None of this is entirely new territory. The 1973 Arab oil embargo sent prices from about $2.90 to $11.65 a barrel, a 300% spike that contracted U.S. GDP, drove unemployment to 9%, and pushed inflation to 12.3%. 6 years later, the Iranian Revolution doubled oil prices again and forced U.S. inflation into double digits. A drone attack on Saudi Aramco in September 2019 knocked out 5.7 million barrels per day, the largest single outage in modern history, though repairs finished within 2 weeks. The pattern repeats every time. A narrow passage closes, energy prices spike, and the pain reaches every consumer and every factory within days. Strategic petroleum reserves buy time, but not much. The U.S. reserve currently holds about 415 million barrels, 58% of its 714 million barrel capacity, with a maximum drawdown rate of 4.4 million barrels per day, and a 13-day lag between a presidential order and oil-reaching market. Set against Hormuz volumes of 20 million barrels a day, the SPR covers roughly 3 weeks. Japan maintains the strongest system globally at 254 days of supply, but even Japan sources 77% of its crude from the Gulf region. No reserve on Earth is large enough to fill the gap left by a prolonged choke point closure. Energy pain arrives fast, but semiconductor disruption cuts deeper and lasts longer, measured not in days, but in the years it would take to rebuild. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, known as TSMC, commands 71% of the global foundry market and fabricates over 90% of the world's most advanced logic chips, anything below 7 nanometers. Every iPhone processor comes from TSMC, every NVIDIA AI chip, every AMD CPU. So do the chips inside F-35 fighters, missile defense systems, satellite communications, and radar arrays. The U.S. Department of Defense depends on overseas providers for approximately 90% of the chips in its technology, and 90% of Air Force precision-guided munitions rely on TSMC-manufactured components. The Taiwan Strait itself averages 180 kilometers wide, nothing like the narrow bottleneck at Hormuz, but $2.45 trillion in annual trade passes through it, including 44% of the world's container fleet. The waterway isn't the vulnerability. What sits on the island at one end of it is. Bloomberg Economics modeled 2 scenarios for a conflict over Taiwan. A full-scale war between U.S. and China would erase 10.2% of global GDP, approximately $10 trillion in the first year alone, with Taiwan's economy collapsing 40%, China's dropping 16.7%, and America's falling 6.7%. Even a blockade without kinetic warfare would drag global GDP down 5%. Bloomberg labeled Taiwan's chip industry the irreplaceable golden screw of the global economy. We already saw a mild preview of chip disruption during the COVID-era semiconductor shortage from 2020 to 2022. That shortage alone cost the U.S. economy an estimated $240 billion in 2021, according to the Commerce Department. Globally, the auto industry hemorrhaged over $210 billion and lost 9.5 million vehicles of production in a single year, while GPU prices surged 300% above retail. 169 separate industries felt the damage, ranging from computers and medical equipment to soap manufacturing and breweries. And during that period, some U.S. manufacturers reported holding less than 5 days' worth of chip inventory. A Taiwan Strait blockade would be incomparably worse. Diversification efforts exist, but the timeline stretches years out, not months. TSMC's $165 billion Arizona campus represents the largest foreign greenfield investment in U.S. history, and its first fab began producing 4-nanometer chips in late 2024. But Arizona currently turns out less than 5% of TSMC's leading-edge output at costs 50% higher than Taiwan. The U.S. CHIPS Act authorized $52.7 billion, which Goldman Sachs noted amounts to about 3% of global semiconductor industry spending. Japan allocated roughly $65 billion, and the EU approved its own CHIPS Act at 43 billion euros. Expert consensus places meaningful diversification 5 to 10 years away. Energy and semiconductors grab the attention, but 60% of the world's consumer goods travel by container ship, nearly $14 trillion worth. The top 10 ocean carriers control about 85% of the global container fleet, which means when choke points close, those goods do not slow down. They stop. March 2021 gave the world a demonstration. The container ship Ever Given ran aground in the Suez Canal and blocked it for 6 days, delaying 432 vessels carrying cargo valued at $92.7 billion. Lloyd's List calculated $9.6 billion in global trade held up each day. One academic study modeled total worldwide losses at $136.9 billion from those 6 days alone. Port congestion surged 300% worldwide, and the backlogs at Los Angeles and Long Beach dragged on for roughly 90 days. Freight prices from East Asia to the Mediterranean hit $7,485 per container, a 500% jump over the year before, and the cascading disruptions took 3 to 6 months to clear after the canal reopened. What the Houthi Red Sea attacks showed, beginning in November 2023, was what sustained disruption actually looks like at Swang. Container shipping through the Red Sea dropped 90% within weeks, and rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope tacked on roughly 11,000 nautical miles, 10 to 14 extra days, and about $1 million in fuel per voyage. That longer routing also ate 9% of effective global container capacity because ships spent more time at sea. War risk insurance premiums exploded 2,700%. They jumped from $50,000 to $70,000 per transit on a $100 million vessel, up to $1 to $2 million. Freight rates from Shanghai to Rotterdam climbed sevenfold between November 2023 and July 2024, and J.P. Morgan estimated the disruptions tacked 0.7 percentage points onto global core goods inflation in the first half of 2024. Egypt's Suez Canal revenue dropped $7 billion that year. Compounding all of that, a severe drought forced the Panama Canal to slash daily transits from 36 vessels down to 18, a 42% cut. Wait times ballooned from 4 days to 22. For the first time in modern history, Two of the world's top choke points were degraded at the same moment, disrupting roughly 18% of global maritime trade simultaneously. People want to know how fast they would feel it at home, and the answer varies by commodity, but it arrives faster than most expect. Fuel hits first because gas stations typically hold only a few days' supply. During the 2021 Colonial Pipeline shutdown, stations burned through several days' worth of inventory within hours as panic buying set in. And 21% of Florida stations ran dry, even though the pipeline did not serve Florida. The current Hormuz crisis pushed U.S. gas prices up roughly $1 per gallon inside 3 weeks. Semiconductors take longer, weeks to months, before shortages bite, but the structural damage runs deeper. Lead times during the COVID chip shortage stretched from 3 to 4 months to over 12 months, and auto manufacturers were forced into production shutdowns within weeks of supply drying up. Grocery stores carry 2 to 3 days of inventory for perishable goods. About 50% of generic drugs consumed in the U.S. come from India, and India relies on China for 90 to 95% of key starting materials, which means those supply chains run lean with almost no inventory buffer. History offers blunt evidence of what happens when blockades persist. During the First World War, the British naval blockade cut German imports to 1/5 of pre-war volume. Official rations by 1917 provided only 1,560 calories per day, falling to roughly 1,000 calories in winter, and historians estimate between 424,000 and 763,000. German civilians died from starvation and disease. A generation later, U.S. submarines sank 88% of Japan's merchant fleet during the Second World War. Oil imports ceased entirely by March 1945. The Japanese government reported to the Diet that the greatest cause of defeat was the loss of shipping. Those are wartime extremes. But the underlying principle holds for peacetime too. Nations that depend on maritime trade, which now includes every major economy on Earth, remain only as secure as the sea lanes that supply them. Sir Walter Raleigh wrote centuries ago that whosoever commands the sea commands the trade of the world, and whosoever commands the trade commands the riches of the world, and the world itself. That line reads differently when you can watch it play out on a live shipping tracker. 3 things have converged to make this moment especially dangerous. Concentration has grown instead of shrinking. TSMC's share of the foundry market climbed from roughly 50% to 71%. At the same time, the world became more aware of the risk, and decades of just-in-time manufacturing stripped away the inventory buffers that once cushioned supply shocks. The threat landscape also shifted in ways nobody anticipated. A relatively small Yemeni militia armed with cheap drones and missiles managed to shut down a choke point carrying over $2 trillion in annual trade, a feat that once required a full navy. And simultaneous disruptions are becoming ordinary rather than extraordinary. Since late 2023, the Red Sea, the Panama Canal, and now the Strait of Hormuz have all been disrupted or degraded at overlapping times, a scenario dismissed as a tail risk just 5 years ago. The diversification efforts underway, the CHIPS Act, nearshoring programs, pipeline construction, fleet expansion, all of these are real. But they are measured in years, while disruptions unfold in days and weeks. More than 80% of global trade by volume still travels through these narrow passages, and the gap between the speed of disruption and the pace of building resilience stands as the defining economic vulnerability of our time. A naval blockade doesn't just stop warships, It stops semiconductors, energy, and consumer goods, creating a home front crisis for every nation involved. And as of today, the world is watching that happen in real time.